Even Capablanca himself said he was completely outplayed in this game. The truth is, he never should have won. His opponent, Janowski, has an attack. I mean, the variations you're going to see in this game are inspiring, and the fact that Capablanca was able to navigate them is really shocking. And this is, again, Janowski was a top player in the world, and this was played in 1911 at San Sebastian. Capablanca has white, Janowski has black. Let us jump right in. D4 is played by Kappa, D5, E3, knight F6, knight F3, and it's a very unambitious opening by Capablanca, basically just like a Kali system formation. C5 is played, and C3 is possible, or B3, but he goes ahead and plays C4, more of a Queen's Gambit concept. The only difference is his bishop, his dark squared bishop, is still inside the pawn chain, so he'll have to find another way to develop that piece, which he does. E6 is played, knight C3, and we have sort of a symmetrical Tarrasch formation here in the center. Bishop to E7, and now DC5. What Capablanca wants to do is to draw this bishop away and then gain a tempo against it with A3 and B4 and develop his bishop to B2. So castles A3. Now Capablanca is threatening to play B4 and permanently to defend that C5 pawn. So black goes ahead and grabs it. B4, bishop to E7, and bishop to B2. So that bishop, which was limited in scope, now has access to this very nice long diagonal leading to black's king side. A5 is played, and what Janowski's trying to do is entice this B pawn forward so that this C5 square is weakened, and he can maybe put a knight there, knight D7, C5. So B5 is played, and B6, gaining control over C5. Of course, he is giving up the C6 square, and that could be a problem for black. So with some nice queenside space, Capablanca takes on D5, creating an isolated queen's pawn. Now, black could take with the knight, but he ends up with an isolated pawn anyway. And the side with the isolated pawn wants to keep pieces on the board so they can use that pawn and the space advantage given by it to attack. So he goes ahead and just takes with the pawn. Knight to d4, Capablanca uses his knight to blockade that pawn. It controls f5. It could potentially jump into c6. It's a well-placed piece. Bishop to d6, potentially threatening some kingside pressure here. Bishop to e2, Capablanca prepares his bishop to go to f3 to attack d5. Bishop e6, defending it twice. Bishop f3, attacking it twice. The knight on c3 also attacks. Rook to a7. You see, black does not want to develop this knight on b8 because it's the one piece that controls c6. Castles and rook to c7, moving that rook to the open file. Now queen to b3, attacking the d5 pawn a third time. And now knight b to d7. And actually, this would be a reasonable time to hop into c6. It would be a mistake for Capablanca to take on d5. And this is the reason. After bishop takes, the move knight to c5 would be played. And after the queen moves, take, black would have this idea, bishop to h2 check, revealing an attack on the queen, and the queen would fall. But that's exactly why, knight to c6 is strong. It moves the queen away, and now you can take the pawn, and that variation doesn't work. So knight c6 would have been pretty strong there. Rook f to d1 instead, though, putting pressure on the pawn, supporting the knight. And here knight to e5. And this is where things begin to get a little tricky for Capablanca. Janowski's pieces gain a lot of activity, and this knight is putting some pressure on this bishop and really threatening to maybe even go to g4. He's got some real kingside pressure here, and Capablanca is in some trouble. The bishop retreats. The queen goes to e7, although he could have played knight e to g4 here and already started his threats. But the queen goes to e7 to connect the rooks. Rook a to c1, rook f to c8, and knight to a4, attacking the pawn at b6. But Capablanca is also offering a trade of all of the rooks. That should reduce black's kingside pressure a bit, getting both pairs of rooks off the board, but we'll see about that. The rooks do come off. And knight to e4. Now, it may look like black is hanging his b6 pawn, but in fact, if Capablanca were to take that pawn, then queen to c7 is a double attack, attacking the knight as well as the bishop on c1. So that pawn is defended for the moment indirectly. But this knight on e4 is very strong. and it puts some serious pressure on this f2 square that White's going to have to worry about. He plays bishop to b2 here, and now, again, he's got pressure on b6. So knight to c4 was played by Janowski, but he had a very strong move here. He could have played queen to f6, directly attacking that f2 square, and that's not easy at all for Capablanca to deal with. If he plays knight to f3, which seems like the most natural move, then Janowski could take with check, bishop takes f3, and then bishop to h2 check. And king h2, queen to h4 check, coming down, attacking the f2 pawn, king g1, queen f2 check, king h2, and then knight to d2, threatening the queen as well as taking on f3, where White could not take back because of the pin on the g pawn, which really would force queen to d1 to defend that bishop. But then this strong idea could have been played d4. And after bishop d4, bishop to b3 with a double attack on the queen and the knight. Now, very few people could see a variation like that, even top GMs, but you could basically, you could get it this far and then say, I'll calculate from here. And he would have been able to find those moves, I'm pretty sure, if he had gotten that far in the variation. But instead, he plays knight to c4, which defends b6 and also clears the way for the bishop at d6 to attack h2. He goes ahead and takes the bishop at c4. And now it would be a mistake to just take back, because then Capablanca could play queen to c2. And now that this d5 pawn is moved, this knight on e4, which is so strong, would be undermined because it's not supported by a pawn anymore. Also, he would be defending the f2 square. So this idea of bishop h2, queen h4, queen f2 wouldn't work anymore. So instead, Janowski doesn't worry about that. He just plays bishop to h2 check. He says you can have the piece for the moment. King h2, queen h4, king g1, queen f2 check. So Janowski has a lot of pressure on White's king, but can Capablanca survive? King h2, queen g3. And note, it's very important to notice, at any moment, Janowski can take a perpetual check if he's okay with the draw, but he is not okay with the draw. He wants to squeeze as much from the position as possible. King g1, dc4, and the position is equal, but here he could have played queen to e1 check, and this is where the variations really make your head spin. King h2 would be forced, but now knight f2, threatening queen to h1. The threat here is to play queen to h1, forcing king g3, then knight to e4 check, king to f3, then queen to h5. This leads to mate as far as I know. Did g4, just queen takes g4 is checkmate. And if king to f4, queen to h4 check, king e5, queen to f6 is mate. So this was a very strong line for Janowski. If instead bishop takes d5, that would be the move that he would play there, probably the best move. But then knight to g4 check, king to h3, and then this amazing shot could have been played, g5, threatening mate on h4. Again, this did not happen in the game. But knight to f3 hits the queen and defends that mating square, but then knight to e3 is a discovered check. And if king to h2, just queen to f2, and that would be decisive. The threat of mate on g2 combined with the double attack on the bishop at d5 simply would end the game. So if bishop to e6 instead, then queen to h1 check, king to g3, and queen to g2 would be mate, because this pawn at g5 controls the f4 and h4 square. Man, you don't expect a human to find all those, but it's really an amazing sequence of variations. But instead, Janowski takes on c4. Queen to c2, queen takes e3 check, king h2, queen to h6 check, king to g1, queen to e3, king to h2, queen to g3. And again, we have a perpetual situation where black could just go back and forth between e1 and h4 if he wanted to get the draw. King g1, queen to e1 check, king h. But he plays knight to f6. He wants more. He wants to mate Capablanca. So knight to f6, threatening to come into g4 and causing trouble. Knight takes e6 from Capablanca, get another attacking piece off the board, and now Janowski only has two attackers, but he feels he can still attack, and he can. Queen to h4 check. He has a perpetual if he wants it. Knight to g4 leads to a draw. King h3 would be a perpetual. So king g1, queen e1. He repeats moves a couple of times, but he doesn't want the draw, so he plays knight to g4, threatening queen to e1 checkmate. So queen to d2 controls the e1 square. The queen at h4 prevents any back rank mates from white, but it's still very sensitive there. Queen to h2 check, king to f1, queen h1, king e2, queen g2 check. And in this position, Capablanca has only one move to survive. Only one. The mistake is king to e1, because then queen to g1 check, king to e2, queen to f2 check, forcing king to d1, then knight to e3 check. And if he doesn't want to just give up his queen for the knight, then king c1, but then queen to g1 check would force queen to d1, and queen takes queen would be checkmate. But what is the move that white needs to play to survive? Well, Capablanca finds it. King to d1. So now the king can survive by moving over. Knight to f2 check, king c2, queen to g6 check. If king to c3, knight to e4, works the king and the queen. If king to c1, queen to g1, well, that actually was played in the game. Queen to g1 check, king c2, queen g6, and we still see Capablanca happy to offer a draw. He'll repeat those moves, no problem. King c1, but Janowski doesn't want to. He wants to keep pressing. He wants to win. So he plays knight to d3 check, king to b1, setting himself up obviously for a discovery, but he's like, well, I've got two minor pieces. Black hasn't captured the knight on e6 yet, so I feel I can move my king to b1. Now black does take on e6, and king to a2 would be a good move from white, but he plays queen to c2, trying to neutralize that discovered attack with the queen. And here, yes, Janowski is down a piece, but he's up 4 pawns. So he says, I'm going to sort of hold it here, and I'm going to advance my pawns. And he plays h5. This pawn is very fast. How is Capablanca going to deal with this pawn advancing up the board? Well, bishop to d4. He threatens to take the pawn with the bishop so that this bishop can come back and try to stop this pawn. h4, bishop b6, h3, and now bishop to c7. The bishop is positioned to stop the pawn. So how does Janowski deal with that? e5. He blocks the bishop. b6. There's a bit of a race here. Queen to e4 from Janowski, a strong move. Not only does it control the the square in front of white's b6 pawn, it also threatens queen to e1 check. Could generate play that way. The queen could go to g2, offering the exchange of queens at some point, perhaps. Bishop takes e5, and now black is winning again. He shouldn't take the bishop because then queen to c4 check attacks the knight and the king. But queen to h1 check would have been very strong after king a2, knight to e5. The knight defends c4, so there's no queen c4 check, and the queen controls b7, and black would actually be winning. Again, Janowski would win in that position. But instead, he plays queen to e1 check. And again, Capablanca is still in the game after that move. King to a2, knight takes e5, b7, knight to d7 to control that queening square, then knight to c5. Obviously, he can't take the knight because then white would queen, and that would be a quick mate. So he plays the knight to b8. Again, on that queening square, queen to c4 check, king to h8, and now knight to e4. Capablanca has cleared the way for his queen to go to c8 with check, a very powerful idea. King to h7, and here queen to c8 would be a mistake because of queen to e2 check. After king to a1, queen f1, king a2, he advances that pawn. This queen on f1 keeps white's queen from checking on h3. That's sort of the idea. If knight to g5 check, king g6, and he eventually survives. And if queen to b8, queen to g2 check, and he's queening, and black would win in that line. But white plays queen to d3, and this is an unbelievable moment. Just an astonishing moment. The move that Janowski needs to play after all of those variations to survive this position and keep his equality is G5. Yeah, that was the move. It was not played in the game. It's a ridiculous move, but it is how you survive. After queen to h3, king g7, we can see here there's just nothing white can do to force a mate, and the king can always move around. After knight to g5, queen to c2 check leads to a draw. But Janowski plays G6 instead. And believe it or not, that loses. G5 is a draw, G6 is a loss. How that's possible, I can't even fathom. Well, actually, we're going to see why that's possible, but it's unbelievable. Queen to H3 check was played in the game. King G7, Queen F3, threatening Queen to F6 check. Queen to C1, Queen to F6 check. Now, here, if King to G8, Queen to E6, King H7, Queen to F7 check, and if King to H8, Queen F8, King H7, Knight to F6, and it's mate. That's the issue. The pawn at G6 takes away the king's one flight square. That's why you have to play G5 instead of G6 because of this mating pattern. That pawn literally blocks that square. If he plays King to H6, by the way, just Queen F5, King H8, Queen H8, King G4, and then Queen to C8. That's a check to the king, and the queens come off the board, and white wins because of that. So what he does instead, he plays King to H7, but after Queen to F7 check again, King H8 leads to that same mating pattern. He does play King to H6, but then what happens is what we just saw. Queen to F8, King H5, check, boom, Queen to C8. And Capablanca wins the game. My goodness. I don't know if I've ever been over a game that's quite that complicated. I don't pretend that I really got to the center of that game, but really a beautiful game. And Capablanca, boy, he survived. I'll tell you, a very, very amazing game. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us at Chess Talk. See you again soon.